Air travel, kind of scary right now. We have more developments in the Jeju Air Flight 2216 that tragically crashed about a month ago in South Korea. And it looks like a case where people cut corners here or there. You may be able to get away with it for a while, but what this case really shows us is when cutting corners doesn't work. Usually when you cut corners, you think that, well, the system is set up where it's feasible that other people will be able to cover the little corner that you've cut. But when every single part of a chain of tragedy involves a cut corner, there's no one really super guilty, but they're all sort of a little bit guilty. And this is when you have a very ripe atmosphere for people pointing fingers and can somewhat legitimately do so. But the one that was most probably guilty was suddenly found unalived a couple weeks after the disaster, when the investigation was really beginning to heat up. Yes, there are a lot of strange coincidental mysteries, like the black box stopped recording 4 minutes before the crash. But what is clear, this is why it's sus, are the ducks, the birds. Birds who can't represent themselves in court, birds who can't hire Kim and Jong or even Sejong law firm to defend their way out of culpability. So it almost seems like we're going to be moving into a situation, if we don't keep our eyes on this, that the birds and the ducks are going to bear the biggest brunt of the responsibility, leaving us without learning real lessons from this case. And if they hang this on a duck, I kid you not, I'm going to send over Donald Duck to regulate. So there's a preliminary report that came out. It was shared with the victim's family first, and then it was shared with the public this week. And it says that the main cause of the accident was a bird strike, landing gear malfunction, and then the disastrous concrete mound that held up the localizer. Now, all of these little areas involved humans cutting corners. And the problem with this type of public safety situation where everything just falls down and cascades like dominoes is that cutting corners is usually done in secret. There's usually some sort of profit that you're taking by cheating the system, and therefore you don't want it to show up on official reports, on official records. And that makes trusting the system all the more perilous and difficult. Because if you are working in the airport control tower, if you are working as a pilot on the plane, you have to trust the information that you're given to make these high-stress decisions, and trust that what you are reading and seeing are the truth. And once you think that everything might not be the truth, then it paralyzes decision making. And what we have seen as a common theme in public safety disasters in Korea and around the world, but let's focus on Korea, like with the Sewol Ferry disaster and the Itaewon crowd crush situation, is that there were corners that were cut. And to a certain extent in Korea, people have a buffer zone or acceptance zone of things not being what they seem to be. For example, there's a lot of sprinkler systems in apartments and in businesses, and a lot of them don't work. And a lot of Korean people already know that. If you think that, oh, well, the sprinkler system will cover it if there's any kind of an emergency, most Korean people are banking. You ask them. Most people in Korea would bank like, oh, no, those don't work. Obviously, they don't work. There was no memo. And so there is a bit of an acceptance that not all the rules are going to be followed. But the problem is that you can't fault the rules, you can't fault the building safety code, and you can't really even fault the construction company because everybody did what they were supposed to do. But maintaining like a sprinkler system costs money, time, resources, and so people kind of cut a corner and let it go. But if you're looking at it on paper, oh, this fulfills the safety regulations because we have a sprinkler system. That's one backup. We'll probably have some other backups. The problem here is all the backups, all the safety nets started to turn into death traps because all of them failed when they were supposed to be there and be present. Now, we shouldn't forget the victims and their families. 179 victims. There were 181 people on board, so 2 survivors. But there is a hidden victim now, somewhat hidden. It was reported in the news, but a person who was the head of the government regulator of airports at the time that oversaw on a macro level, the localizer situation was suddenly found unalived. And we will go into that, but that's a weird coincidence. So despite the black box stopping recording 4 minutes before the crash, we're basically on the final descent, we were able to, with now some of the pieced together timeline with data from the control tower, know a little bit more about the specific happenings of the plane. So this plane departed Bangkok December 29th. It was a red eye, so a lot of pilots have said like that's a horrible time right in the morning, even though 9 a.m. seems like you're fresh and ready to go, but 9 a.m. as the end of your shift is one of the worst times to be making high stress emergency scenario decisions. The crash itself happened at 9:02:57 seconds a.m. And we have the first contact being recorded at 8:54 a.m. The aircraft attempted the first contact with the Muon control tower for a landing approach. 3 minutes later, at 8:57, the control tower notified the aircraft of bird activity. And remember, this airport was built next to bird sanctuaries, famous bird sanctuaries, even sanctuaries that Korea really tries to promote as part of its tourism and national pride. The pilots saw the birds below the aircraft, and 39 seconds later, apparently, the recordings stopped. Now, at the time of the recording interruption, the aircraft was flying at an altitude of 498 feet and a speed of 161 knots. The average landing speed for a commercial airplane is 130 to 150 knots, so it was going a little bit faster. Whether it stopped recording when it, should get to the point of 150 and maybe the speed was fine, but it was still going a little bit fast. It had landing gear problems, but the pilot also repeatedly called out to the control tower at approximately 8:58 and 56 seconds a.m. that there was a mayday due to a bird strike. Investigators have looked at the engines. They have found bird DNA, bird feathers, bird blood, and they even were able to isolate which variety of bird it was. Not that it was the only bird, but it is a local duck. And so the main causes were the bird strike, landing gear malfunction, and then the concrete mound. All of those situations where if it was only just one of them, just one out of the 3 main reasons, most likely the plane would have been fine. But this combination of the 3 due to literally, it looks like, is it just, oh, just an oopsie, or were there humans actually cutting corners either years before, minutes before, hours before? It all came together and created this tragedy. So the bird, let's get it out of the way because it is seen as a culprit. I would like to see them tie up a cage of birds and put it in the witness stand and ask them, why were you swirling around the airport when you had no business being there? But it is a whooper swan, which the name itself, whooper swan, has a lot of different categories, but the one that they're specifying is the baikal teals, a type of migratory duck that flies to South Korea in the winter. So it comes from Siberia, even a cold, Korea's cold right now, very cold right now. So you're just like, why are they flying there for for their snowbird holiday? Well, comparing Siberia and Korea, it might be like Club Med over there in the southern part of Korea. So it is a natural habitat for these birds, and these birds just be birding the way Mother Nature intended them to do. I don't think they have a textbook and a primer in duck school about airports and 737 jet engines that you might get swallowed up into and cause problems for an airplane. Bird strikes in the past, bird strikes are a common thing, but bird strikes that have caused a very dramatic landing that we have seen where people have survived. Two big examples are the miracle on the Hudson River landing in 2009. That was from a bird strike. And then in 2019, there was a cornfield landing in Russia, also from a bird strike. So being struck by birds, and if everything else is perfect, it is possible to survive that type of emergency situation. But bird strike with no landing gear, and then with the localizer mound at the end of the runway that created the impact, all those three together guaranteed tragedy. Now, even if the reason why it looks like perhaps this situation came about like the person involved in deciding on making a concrete mound for the localizer or not, is that even with the bird strike and faulty landing gear and overshooting the runway, most likely there would have been a lot more survivors of this plane crash. But because of that concrete mound, it almost made it a done deal that no, you can't have people really expected to survive. Now, a little bit of clarification. I think there was some misunderstanding of this concrete mound / wall. This was not the concrete wall that borders the airport. It didn't go all the way to the end of the airport. So some people were saying like, well, there's nothing you can do because you got to have a concrete wall to, fence off the airport. And that's normal. It wasn't that at all. It was way beyond, it was way closer than the border wall. It was essentially a mound that looked like dirt. And in most cases, so for pilot training and all of that kind of stuff, like you would expect, like if you asked a pilot, would you expect if you crashed into the localizer mound, it'll just kind of cut through like butter? Maybe it's a little bit dangerous, but it's supposed to collapse if there's any impact. But the way that they had designed it in Korea at this airport, and then when, there was criticism, they had the audacity to say like, oh, well, we do this in other airports. That's even worse. That they probably saved some money on the construction by just dragging out leftover concrete or something and created an elevation platform for the localizer. The localizer is the radio signals or whatever electronic signals for the airplane that helps them do an auto landing or guided landing. And apparently it was too low, so they had to raise it up. But usually when you raise it up on these big towers, they're kind of like these spindly metal towers that, if an airplane, had to go through it, God forbid, it wouldn't be that big of a deal. But it was propped up on concrete. And worse than that, if they had just left the concrete and the pilot could have seen visually like, oh, wait a minute, this localizer, that looks like a concrete mound. We can't overshoot this that way. They would have probably made a different decision, but they covered the concrete in dirt to maybe blend it in. And so, or maybe even hide the fact that they use concrete instead of, really regulation standard, just spindly towers. And so that seems to be, in my mind, if you're going to choose between three, landing gear malfunction, birds, and the concrete mound as the biggest culprit, it's got to be the concrete mound. That landing gear, yes, there's been a lot of problems with landing gears and particularly that plane model. But could it have survived a belly landing on land or, done that? They would have had to have done anyway because it didn't work. And they have to figure that out with that plane manufacturer of there's a lot, too many malfunctions. But we can see that there's going to be a lot of finger pointing here. So this is why the commission and the report is very important. They released the 5th stage out of 12 stages of an accident investigation. The Air Force is going to disassemble the plane and check the condition, and they're going to be responsible for answering the question, why didn't the landing gear not work? Now, you could probably argue a little bit in court. I'm sure they're going to argue it from each side, that if the airport is probably saying well, if the landing gear worked, the plane would have never have overshot the runway. So therefore the airplane should have worked, and then concrete mound or not, it wouldn't have crashed in there. Sure, maybe it was a Mayday landing because of the bird strikes, but the landing gear didn't work. Now the airplane manufacturer is probably going to point the finger at the bird saying well, this airplane would normally work, but this bird situation is out of the margin of error that we should be responsible for. This is like an act of God or Mother Nature, and therefore, had the birds not strike, them landing gear should have been fine. Now, this is the critical point. Did the landing gear fail before the birds or after the birds? And I think that's why it's super sus that the black box recordings stopped, because during that pivotal 4 minutes from the data, we could probably see when the landing gear was a problem. If the landing gear was a problem before the bird strike, then them birds, whether they, flew in or stayed away, wouldn't matter in the culpability of that plane malfunctioned with or without birds. But if it was after the bird strike and they want to make it seem that way, then suddenly black boxes seem to disappear. So the Air Force is going to try to analyze the plane forensically, more from an engineering perspective of why the plane's landing gear malfunctioned. Now, the South Chola Provincial Police Agency is setting up this month-long investigation that's going to be more criminal, about people, officials, the decisions they made, whether they made these decisions because of a corrupt profit type of situation where if you cut corners, maybe send your kids to college. So they are going to do this with 20 people so far. They're going to look at the work history, the work processing system of the airline. They're going to look at the airport, and they're questioning the witnesses. Right now, apparently, they say that there's no formal investigation targets, but They did put a travel ban on the Jeju Air CEO and another Jeju Air official because they are going to be important witnesses. Also, the concrete mound. Who was responsible for the concrete mound and who definitely at the top? So in Korea, and probably other places, but especially in Korea, the chain of responsibility quickly goes up to the top, even though maybe there are other people below. It definitely operates more on the situation of, when they were doing like the war criminal trials of like the Holocaust, everybody's saying like, I was just following orders. And it depends on whatever your legal system is like, how much does the buck stop with you, even if you were following orders? In Korea, there's a lot of leeway for like, well, I have to follow orders, so it just shoots straight to the top. So even though the former head of the state-run Korea Airports Corporation, who was in office at the time, not the current one, but in office at the time of making the decisions about the localizer, was not declared an official suspect or even a person that was going to be investigated a couple of weeks ago when this happened. He was found unalived on January 21st. It looks like he would have been the prime person at the top to be questioned and the prime person to be taking the fall should all of this investigation turn out that there was some funny business going on. Now, the police have stated that he was not unalived by any indications of intrusion or foul play. He was just found by his wife at his home at 6:03 p.m. and he was gone. But there was no unaliving note in the apartment. So whether it was truly unalived or if he was unalived by somebody else, the fact remains is that the person who could have answered the most amount of questions is now gone. That complicates matters. Now, the reason why this is a little bit more sus in my mind, and the reason why it's really hard to make any type of indications whether it was voluntary or involuntary is that, both things are very probably probable, is that he was not an aviation expert. His background was being a bigwig in the police of South Korea. He ran this Korea Airports Corporation between 2018 to 2022. Apparently, the localizer decision to make a concrete mound was in 2020. So he ran it for 4 years, and he was seen as a parachute appointment, which basically means a plum job that's appointed by the president of the country and as a political favor, because he has, and in this kind of situation, there's a lot of these agencies and organizations that are run by people who really have no experience in what's going on. And so that leaves them to a lot of vulnerability of not knowing what decisions to really make, and then also being goaded along by people who are entrenched in the system who want to take advantage of his dictatorial power. So the problem with Korean appointees, when they say it's a parachute, because they just jump in and then you're supposed to like run big things even though you have no experience, is that they do have actually a lot of power. I would understand, and it would make a little bit more sense if their power was a little bit more restrained and you let the institution continue to take care of it. But there's a lot of decisions that come from somebody who just parachutes right in, and they're making decisions that in any other situation you'd think like you need decades of experience and expertise to make these types of decisions. Well, he was a person that came up into prominence from the police Academy. So he was the chief of the Gyeonggi Ansan Police Station, chief of the Seoul Gangnam Police Station. That is super prestigious. Chief of the Gyeonggi Provincial Police Agency. So like it seemed like wherever he could be the chief and the head of, and whether it's in the capital city or whether it's in the provinces, he had that type of experience, gravitas. He was even the dean of the Korean National Police University. But then you're thinking like, but then why? How could you justify getting like a super big dog in the police agency world to run the airport corporation? Usually this is what happens. You become more of a politician at that point, at that level. And then so he got appointed as a standing auditor on the Korea Railroad Corporation. So you just serve on the board, you might oversee, but then on your resume, you have national transportation experience, and therefore it can be justified like, he was an auditor on the railroad corporation, so why not make him the head of the Korea Airport Commission? It was definitely a political favor when you look at the timing. So in 2018, he was appointed to be the president of the Korea Airport Corporation. He had just recently lost an election to the National Assembly. So in those types of scenarios, if you're still good with the party leadership and if you have that political power, then you can get some sort of plum appointment like this. But now we're seeing like this is not a good situation. So could he have cut corners, or they did cut corners, I believe, with the appointment of somebody who has no experience in airports. Remember his transportation experience with the railroads. I don't know, last time I've never seen a train sprout wings and fly and had to deal with ducks. That was cutting corners at that appointment level, thinking like, hey, well, the airports have a policy, the pilots know what they're doing, the airplanes themselves have a policy. You're thinking like, well, everybody else is doing like 110%, so why don't we slide in somebody, who fulfills our political objective 110%, but, he's just going to delegate. So why not? And in some ways, maybe it would have been fine. We would never have been talking about this situation if there weren't the bird strikes, which were also cutting corners because you made an airport despite the environmental study that said it's not a good thing to do to put an airport right next to a bird sanctuary. And then we don't know specifically about what happened with this plane, but we do know from data from other instances of this particular plane model being problematic, which means that if it's a problematic plane, you're leaning on the airline to have more maintenance, and you're thinking like, well, these maintenance things with the airplanes are pretty stringent, so let them handle the load. At some point, the straw is going to break the camel's back. Not one safety net is strong enough to replace all the safety nets that people have instituted. And in this type of situation, it seems like it was a pretty reasonable scenario of if everybody just did what they were supposed to do on paper, we probably wouldn't even be talking about this situation, because this situation probably would not have resulted in a mass casualty death. But we have seen now that the system needs to be reformed. So when people say, oh, we need to reform the system, yeah, it's the parts of the weakest links in the chain that break the whole thing, even though it looks strong on some certain areas. So how are the families holding up? The families are still at the airport. They're camping out. They're trying to make sure that this investigation is complete, thorough, and fair. And they are going to leave the airport apparently by February 15th and return to their daily lives, because the special investigation team that was set up has promised that it's going to be fair and thorough. The acting president, the minister of transportation have paid a lot of attention and at least exerted public expressions of sympathy and empathy with the bereaved families. Even for Lunar New Year, they met with them and then gave them some gifts and condolences. And they're promising that they're going to pass a law that will probably bring funds to help these families. And then the police said that they're going to really see what's on the books that can make people accountable, particularly in the Occupational Negligence Homicide Act and the Serious Disaster Punishment Act. So we're going to see now a stress test of whether these acts and laws, especially years after other public safety disasters, are going to have any real teeth and to get real justice. Now, the thing that is on a larger scale, like why would they, it seems to me that they are paying more attention to this disaster, not only because of its scale in terms of like what you can see, but it is really not, in my opinion, really about public safety. It's to save the future of these pork barrel projects that really fund the political careers. Right now, there might be an immediate threat to a potential power shift in the presidential election with President Yoon Suk-yeol, like, undergoing his impeachment trial. And right now it's very ripe for the liberal camp to win the presidency, and South Cholla province, where this crash happened, is the main voting bloc for the liberal camp. So if you have some sort of scandal like this that goes years in the making, that really will potentially shift public opinion against the liberal camp enough where they may lose the presidential election. That's the immediate political thing, which is why there's a lot of these mysterious coincidences that happen when there's like a big political stake. But then even long term, are people actually going to put their support and their tax dollars behind these pork barrel projects when it looks like y'all not taking good care of the projects that you're making, and it looks like you are just pocketing the money? Yes, you do have to give Korea credit where credit is due in a non-Goldilocks type of world, where a lot of the great infrastructure that you love when you go visit Korea, there's a lot of them. Why? Because it's also like a pork barrel project, but it ended up being like, okay, so maybe some officials had backroom deals and, it kind of lubricates a bit of this corrupt system, but fast KTX train built in record time, expansion of airports around the country, and all these other building projects that you see, even like great parks and stuff like that. But when you have a situation like this where they didn't even on the surface take care of the obligation for public safety, then I think there will be a bit of a public backlash against these types of projects, because it's one thing to feel like some of your tax dollars are being pocketed and squirreled away and you're being screwed there. It's another thing when this project potentially will end the life of you or your loved ones. So it's a totally different calculus. So not only did we have a landing gear malfunction of Jeju Air as well a few days after this December 29th disaster, we also had recently an Air Busan Airbus plane catch fire at South Korea's Busan airport, and everybody on that plane was evacuated and saved. There was nobody who lost their lives, but some people had some injuries, and they think that it was a fire due to some sort of battery, but they're still investigating it. But again, what is going on with the system here? And are people going to really be able to trust that people are going to stop cutting corners like this? Because if you look at probably everything by the book. What more is there really to do? I don't think it's like an incompetence of planning issue. Doesn't seem like even that much of an incompetence of like what we pledge to do under our work processes, but something is slipping through the cracks within this system, and they have to be identified, and nobody wants to identify them because that means you're going to get in trouble. But you escaping trouble puts the entire system at risk. And I think that's what Korean people and people around the world in similar situations really need to be adamant on, is that these aren't just whoopsie accidents. We have to be able to isolate where the corners are being cut, and please do not blame a few ducks on this situation. They just be ducking the way that they duck, and don't try to duck out of culpability by hanging it up on some birds that have been migrating all the way from Siberia. All right, guys, put your comments below. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you again next time. Bye-bye.